Hello, 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 everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. First, I want to start by thanking God for this morning. By Him, we live and move and have our being. I want to also thank my co-host, who's not here yet. He'll be joining us shortly. He had a slight emergency, Jesse McCoy. I want to also thank our partner, Kichi Jairo. I want to thank the whole AfriScope community. I want to also thank the Pan-Africana Presents AfriScope community. And again, we have a special guest this morning, a man I respect really very much. He's a God-fearing man. He's a husband. He's a father. And he's also a professor, a tenured professor at Santa Clara State. He's very knowledgeable about the diaspora, with what we trying to achieve in Pan-Africana. I thought no better person than this gentleman. He's well-read, full-time professor at Santa Clara State, and he teaches African American studies and African studies, African history. And without much ado, I want to welcome our guest today, Professor Harry Odampton. How you doing, Harry?
I'm doing very well, Fred. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of your program. And I hope that we're going to have a fruitful discussion. And thanks for the opportunity to share my work and what I've been doing as an academic for the past, decade or so. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so today we're going to be discussing. He's also an author. One thing I didn't add in my intro, he's also an author. We're going to be discussing his book, Edward Blyden. I'm going to share the screen here, show it to you, and I'll show it to you later when we're closing out. Give me a second here.
That's right.
Okay, so there it is. So it's Edward W. Blyden's Intellectual Transformations. And it's a great book. I've been reading it, and I couldn't stop reading it.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, it's a wealth of information in there, and by all means, get it, and I believe your life will not be the same. Okay, so back. Yeah, so Prof, can you start by telling everyone about yourself?
Well, which part of myself?
Okay, welcome, Jesse. Jesse just
joined. Hey, how y'all doing? Good morning.
Doing very well.
Where you are.
Okay. Well, as you rightly stated, I'm an associate professor of history at Santa Clara University, where I've been teaching for the past 9 years.
Okay.
Before coming to Santa Clara, I was a visiting professor at the University of Central Arkansas for a year, and prior to that, I was at Michigan State University, where I earned a dual PhD in history and African American and African studies, and came to Michigan State University by way of the University of Ghana, Legon, where I'd been pursuing an MA in African Studies at the Center for African Studies. So that's my academic trajectory going backward, and I married, have 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. My wife Clementine Odampton is a nurse practitioner, and so she practices here in the Bay Area, and my kids are very young, as Mr. Fred knows my kids, so
yes.
And
that's a beautiful family.
So, yes, that's well, maybe me in a nutshell. I was born and raised in Ghana, West Africa. I was born in a little town called La, and went to school in Ghana, went to boarding school in Cape Coast at the Ghana National College, and then did my sixth form at a school called Laboni Secondary School, and then from there I went to the University of Ghana. So that's how I lived. I went to boarding school in Ghana, for those that are unaware of how the boarding school system functions. It's not like boarding school here in America.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
All right, Jesse.
Well, I just want to say I apologize for my tardiness here. I ran into a little bit of a snafu this morning, but it's a pleasure to meet you, man. I've heard so much good stuff about you from Fred. So I'm getting ready to receive all this education, this information you're bringing to us today.
Well, thank you for having me. And I hope that we have a nice discussion. And thank you for the opportunity to share my book, Wilmer Blyden's Intellectual Transformations.
All right. Okay, so why Edward Blyden? Why him in particular? I have an idea, but
well, why Edward Blyden? I think if you tend to the acknowledgements, I don't know if you read the acknowledgements of the book.
Okay.
But if you tend to the acknowledgements, you get a sense of why Edward Blyden. Mainly because I have been interested in intellectual history. Very often when people think about African history, people do not talk about African intellectual history. And as I speak, there's really in our discipline and in our multidisciplinary studies, we don't have a well-defined field called intellectual history. I mean, there are intellectual historians who are doing that work. But we really don't have a well-defined canon and so forth. So that's why I've been interested in intellectual history. And so if you turn to page 193 of the book, it says, or I have written, for this book, special thanks go to the pioneering scholarship of Hollis Lynch, Robert July, and Peter Esedebe. Without them, this study would have been considerably more difficult. Studying the origins of modern African thought first got me interested in African intellectual history and eventually led me to Lynch's seminal biography and other writings on Blyden. Esedebe's book, Pan-Africanism, The Idea and Movement, 1776 to 1963, still stands as the cornerstone of scholarship on Pan-Africanism. So, you see that I stand on the shoulders of giants in writing this book about Blyden. Yeah. I'm not the first person to ever write about him. There are a couple of books out there about Blyden. But Blyden is also a very, if I may, a very cerebral scholar, an autodidact who was interested in so many things and wrote about so many subjects. So he's a very complex individual to write about, and people are not so much interested in, taking up such a huge personality. And so that's why you perhaps have not heard about Edward Blyden before. But I was interested in him because I think he encompasses what I wanted to achieve earlier on when I was talking about intellectual history. Because in him, we're able to see an epitome of African and African-American intellectual history, being someone who was born in the Caribbean, comes to Africa as a teenager, has this epiphany or intellectual transformation, and becomes a conduit for the exchange of information between Africans and African-Americans in the Caribbean and in the diaspora in general. He made sense for me to write about as this sort of conduit within this larger Atlantic world where there's exchange of information, exchange of ideas between people of African descent.
Wow.
So I'm curious now, for people who may have never heard about Brother Blyden before now, right? What can you give us a little bit of the backstory about who he was and what made him significant and why we all should learn about him?
Well, Blyden was born on an island called St. Thomas. And for those of you who may not know, this is what we now refer to as the Virgin Islands. So St. Thomas is one of the 3 islands that forms part of the Virgin Islands, which are now part of the United States. But these islands were what in the 18th, 17th centuries were Danish West Indies islands. So we had different types of. You had the Dutch West Indies, you had the English Caribbean, or the English British West Indies, and so forth. But these were Danish West Indies islands, and they had been established by the Danes, because the Danes also had their own trade and slave traffic coming from West Africa. The islands were mostly established and settled by Dutch settlers. So you have a very interesting configuration when it comes to the islands. The islands were majority Black population, but then you had Dutch settlers, but the official language was Danish, and you had a Danish governor, and so forth and so on. So these islands represent a special place. But Blyden's parents themselves did not originate on the island. They came from a Dutch island by the name of Saint Eustatius. And if you know anything about Saint Eustatius, it's a place where when the British were fighting the Americans, it became a very interesting place of contestation. Blyden's parents migrated from that island, came to the Danish West Indies, and in the book, I really talk about how and why they may have come to the Danish West Indies, and I suggest that they may have come because they were following either a connection to a Jewish family or that Blyden's parents may have been previously enslaved, or their grandparents or his grandparents may have been previously enslaved, because the Jewish settlers who moved around parts of the Caribbean had been the ones to settle on the island. And so when you follow Blyden's family's travels throughout the Caribbean, you see that they were really following the Jewish migration within the Caribbean. So there was that connection. In any case, Blyden is born on the island of St. Thomas, and he grows up. He's mentored by a Dutch preacher who John Knox, and he ends up being interested in coming to school in the United States. When he arrives, he's unable to go because we know that at this time a lot of Black folk are not allowed to go to institutions of higher learning, and he wasn't going to be allowed.
This is Rutgers, right?
Yeah, Rutgers. Yeah. And so he's kind of despondent. He's working as a servant in a white home in New York, and at the same time, in this period, you have what we call the fugitive slave law, which was being misused by a lot of people. You also have blackbirding or slave catching. But sometimes, if you know the story of 12 Years a Slave,
you
know that people were falsely taken into enslavement. And so there was all of these fears at that time, and Blyden was advised to go to Africa. And so Liberia, which had been established by the American Colonization Society, and he had a relationship through his mentor Knox with the Presbyterian Church and with the American Colonization Society. So he ends up going to Liberia as an 18-year-old person, and his life changes dramatically as he gets his high school education and pursues higher laurels. So that's what Blyden's background looks like. But he emerges as sort of this huge personality and what I describe as the most influential Black intellectual of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I say in the book that if we think of W.E.B. Du Bois as the most influential intellectual of the 20th century, he was preceded by Blyden. So that was the kind of, at the time, the kind of, celebrated status that Blyden enjoyed amongst intellectuals, his own peers, within the, whether it was Jewish intellectuals, whether it was African intellectuals, whether it was African American intellectuals, Caribbean intellectuals. Blyden loomed large within these spaces, and his works were celebrated. He was invited to speak in many places and so forth. So in a nutshell, if I was describing Blyden, this is what I would say.
All right. I have a question. When I was reading a book, I realized Blyden was well traveled, and can you comment on that? And as you know, over here we encourage a lot of people to travel, and one wise man, both you and I know, says if you don't travel, then you're not educated.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, Blyden's own parents were migrants to the island of St. Thomas. And so that's part of his background. And actually, it's also, if we're talking about the African diaspora, it's part of the African and African diaspora condition, right? Where because the economic models or the world economic system that we find ourselves in is stacked against us. We are always facing certain push out factors that pushes us out into different spaces. So you find a lot of Caribbean people in Jamaica, other places, the Barbados and other places migrating to the United States, for example, in search of a variety of things, in search of peace, in search of economic transformation and so forth and so on. Or we can even go back to the transatlantic slave trade and talk about the migration of millions of people from Africa to the Americas and so forth. But so going back to Blyden's story, we know that Blyden's great grandparent was one of the people that was taken into enslavement. That was forced migrant to the Americas, and then his own parents migrate from St. Eustatius in search of better opportunities, in search of a place where they can be free, right? So the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of economic transformation is a part of the Black condition, and it sort of turns these wheels of migration on. And so Blyden's parents migrate to St. Thomas, but they don't live in St. Thomas all of their lives. They actually also migrate to other parts of the Caribbean, like I said, following the Jewish migration. So Blyden actually lives 2 years in Venezuela, depending on who you're talking to. Blyden acquired the use of Spanish. He could speak Spanish, he could write in Spanish and many other languages. Then they returned to St. Thomas. Okay. And then Blyden ended up coming to the United States. Okay, so within his short life, before even going to Africa, he's been to different parts of the Caribbean, born in the Caribbean, been to Venezuela, he's been to the United States of America, and then he goes to Africa, where he travels in many places in West Africa and other places. He becomes also conversant with places in Europe. He becomes a very famous intellectual, particularly among Victorian circles. All right. And he meets the Queen, he meets many important intellectuals during this time period. But that is why it is important, because any Pan-African intellectual or Pan-African personality, whether it's Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, these people become Pan-Africanist because they become acquainted with the conditions of people of African descent, not only in the local space that they live in, but in international spaces. And that forces them to begin to think in a Pan-African way, because they now see that their conditions are not just about that local space, but the condition is linked to all of the other spaces where Black people find themselves.
Amen. Amen. So let me ask you this. What is the challenge, or I guess what inhibits us as a culture, as a diaspora, from coming together? Because if we know individually in our local areas, we're all dealing with some ramification of either supremacy or colonialism that's been established and entrenched, what stops us from building our own networks and stepping outside of our comfort zone?
Well, I would say that it is not that there has not been an attempt to build these networks. As I was saying earlier on, in the book, I make a distinction between Pan-Africanism as an idea and Pan-Africanism as a movement. And I think that distinction is very important. The point that I'm making about about intellectual history in general, because I think it is important not only to think about our culture and all of that, but to think of Africans as a thinking people, to think of Black people as people who think, as people who engage with ideas and so forth. And so Pan-Africanism is one of these ideas that have emerged, over centuries, depending on what century you want to look at. Some of the principal ideas would have emerged among enslaved Africans who ran away from the plantations and formed maroon societies and said, well, we may not be able to go back to Africa where we came from, but we're going to form African-like societies where we're going to be independent of this plantation structure that oppresses us, and we're going to oppose this plantation structure from the outside. Okay, so some of those ideas were there. In other words, the early ideas of legitimating or legitimizing who we are as a people, that we are also human, we also have our own social, political, and economic institutions, and they are every bit as legitimate as other institutions. All right. Those ideas begin to, and then in the 18th century, you have a bunch of intellectuals that come up, particularly African-born intellectuals who come to Europe to be educated, and others like Olaudah Equiano, okay, who's a slave who becomes a writer. His book becomes very important. And the point I make in the book about Olaudah Equiano is that even though people talk about him, the center of all of his work was in Africa. He wrote about the Igbo space that he came from. He wrote about the African space which he came from. And his latter work was about Africa. Okay, so the book is really about talks about the centering of Africa. Okay, in our ideas, in our thoughts, by these intellectuals and so forth. So going back to your question, it is not that people have not thought about coming together and so forth, but it's been something that has been emerging from the early, let's say, 17th until the 20th century. People like Blyden were engaging in these ideas, but it was actually in the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, that it becomes a movement where we have from the 1900 Pan-African Conference and the subsequent congresses that were organized by W.E.B. Du Bois in various parts of Europe, ending with the 1945 Pan-African Conference in England, and that becomes sort of the platform where a lot of African leaders emerged and catapulted them to become leaders of the independence struggle in Africa. So Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and a couple of other people were participants in this 1945 Congress in Manchester. And so there's been an idea, and then there's been a movement towards achieving this. What makes it particularly difficult in the African diaspora is because in Africa, you have nation states, and African nation states can decide to be a part of an African union. However, when you come to the diaspora, people of African descent belong to nations, and those nations, they share not by themselves, but they share with other people who are not of African descent. So in the United States of America, you have people of Latino, Hispanic descent, you have people of white European descent, and so forth. And so it's not a space where they can decide right, make those decisions. But still, African Americans still participate in the movement, right? And you can see it in culture. You can see it in the various groupings that are formed by people of African descent throughout the Americas, whether it's Brazil, all right, whether it's Jamaica, whether it's the United States. People continue to form groups. The point that I think that you are raising is, why have we not been successful in doing this? And like I said, one of the difficulties of achieving that has been because in the diaspora we don't have nation states. All right, some parts of the Caribbean you have mostly fully people of African descent, and they are able to do that. So you have the Caribbean groupings, and there's been this move within the African, what is now the African Union, to make the African diaspora as another region. So you have North Africa, you have South, West, and East Africa, and then the African diaspora is also now a region within the African Union. But how to determine representation on the African Union is something else, right? Because you're dealing with a nation state. Whereas you have a country like Ghana, Nigeria, Morocco, and other countries participating as nation states, how are people in the African diaspora going to participate? And I think that the African Union is continuing to work on that to determine how to make. I think Haiti is now a part of the African Union, or has actually been applying to become a part of the African Union. So there are moves towards doing that.
Quite interesting.
Wow. So in your book, you commented about the Back to Africa movement with Blyden, and then you compared it to the Jewish, because he also grew up around Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on that? You sort of compared the two.
Yes. So in our field, or when it comes to African diaspora studies in the specific, when people began to define the field, one of the ways in which they tried to define the field was to sort of think about the African diaspora in the context of the Jewish diaspora, right? How the Jewish diaspora was formed. And so that's what I was suggesting in the book. But people were sort of commenting and analyzing that, well, the Jewish diaspora is a diaspora of itself, and the African diaspora is a different diaspora. There are lessons to be learned from the Jewish diaspora, but it is also important to establish the African diaspora studies and to understand African diaspora communities within and of themselves as different entities. But what I've tried to do in the book is that while that is a legitimate thing to do, it is also important to recognize where the two diasporas intersect. Right. And so for Blyden was able to have that type of intersection, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of the migration within the Caribbean. When you follow the Jewish migrants that left St. Eustatius, you'd see that they also went to Venezuela and other parts of the Caribbean, the same path that Blyden's family took, which meant that there was some type of relationship between Blyden's family and the Jewish families that left St. Eustatius to come to St. Thomas. I'm yet to establish that relationship in full, but that's where it is. So Blyden grew up in the Jewish community in St. Thomas, and was able to see the Jewish community at a personal level, and so he was very much influenced by them. Of course, he becomes a preacher. He becomes a Presbyterian trained minister. He travels to what is now Israel, and on his own pilgrimage, he goes to Palestine. And in the book, I talked about some of his observations about going there, and so forth. So it was something that really influenced him. And I also discussed Blyden as someone who influenced a lot of public spheres. Okay, so I talked about how Blyden influenced the Jewish public sphere, how he was in discourse with a lot of Jewish intellectuals concerning For example, the Jewish return back to Palestine, and how Blyden himself conceptualized this return. For Blyden, it was more of a spiritual return to Zion rather than just a physical return. But a lot of Jewish intellectuals were debating this among themselves. And here comes this African that discourse, right? Because he was very familiar with their language, he could read their scripts, he studied Arabic and so forth. So he could read and insert himself into that discussion. And then he talked about how their diaspora, the formation of their diaspora, was similar to the formation of the African diaspora. But from there emerges Blyden's idea of an African standpoint, where he talks, or what we now say is an African centeredness. That in order to understand African societies, you would have to be centered in the African condition. You have to understand and center the African condition in order to understand African societies and communities. And that is something that had happened to Blyden himself, right? Because when he first comes to Africa as an 18-year-old, he has certain ideas about Africans and African societies, African cultures, and so forth. But gradually, as he lives in Liberia, he has this epiphany, and he's like, wait, we should not be denigrating these societies and cultures as people of the diaspora. In fact, we have something to learn from these cultures in order to have this, what he later called the African personality, right? Rather, he was thinking that rather than just taking up European culture and mores and values and so forth, there's a lot to be gained from African cultures and values and mores and so forth. That has to be nurtured into what he called the African personality, right? Or the Black personality, right? And so sort of that transformation is what leads him to write what I term his final book. But his final book is actually a book called The Arabic Bible, a plea for transliteration. But that's sort of a different type of genre of writing. But his as far as Africa and Black societies are concerned, the final book is African Life and Customs. So Blyden engages African life and customs and begins to see value in some of these customs, and he says that these values should be nurtured and become what he called the African personality. Later on, George Padmore, who was a Trinidadian, alongside Kwame Nkrumah, would take up this idea of the African personality when the independence movement within Africa started and the Caribbean started in the late 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century.
Jesse,
what's going on? I hear you.
Oh yeah, you're breaking up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, there you go. You're fine.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I have a whole lot of questions. I was saying you could go.
Oh, okay. Well, I have a question. I want to step away from Edward Blyden for a minute. I want to talk about your experience now, seeing this, how you've seen how it is in two separate continents. What are some of the challenges that you personally had to kind of overcome or get accustomed to? And what makes us, I guess, the Black community in America so different or similar to the Black community in Ghana?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, of course, I do this introspection every now and then. How do I put it? Well, my experience is not every African's experience, right? I'd known a lot of African Americans before even coming to the United States. I have some godparents, the late Reverend Dr. Michael C. Murphy, my uncle in Grand Rapids, Uncle Purcell Singleton, the Singleton family in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then I got to know a lot more African Americans when I arrived here in the United States to go to graduate school at Michigan State University. So my experience is quite different from a lot of people. And when I arrived in the States, the people that I had the most interaction with were these families. I lived in Reverend Michael C. Murphy's house. I lived in a black professor, Harriet Pipes McAdoo, a very important intellectual who wrote this book that I have here, Black Families.
Their families.
Yeah. Her name is Harriet Pipes McAdoo, and she was a university distinguished professor at Michigan State University. So I'm very familiar with these African Americans. I was raised by African Americans. If I'm talking about my experience in the United States, so I'm able to see a lot of similarities in terms of our culinary experiences, similarities in culinary culture, right? In family culture, with my brother, Brandon, which is Dr. Michael C. Murphy's son. I was able to travel different places in Michigan because he had a lot of family in Michigan, and we would go out and engage with different families. So that was the nature of my if you like, baptism to the United States. Yeah. And then when, as an academic, I became a part of this research group called the African Atlantic Research Team at Michigan State University, headed by Waleem Datson. And a lot of the people who were part of the group were African Americans. And that was the group that I hang out with. I'm talking about my friend Shanti Zaid, Sonia Maria Johnson, and a number of other people who I mentioned in my book. And of course, being in an African American and African Studies program, I came into contact with a lot of people. So I had the practical experience and also sort of the academic experience in studying about Black intellectuals and so forth. So that has been my experience in terms of, well, I mean, the distinction is this. The distinction is this: African peoples live in their quote unquote, I don't want to say original societies. They live in the societies that their parents, their grandparents, etc. lived in. African Americans do not. They were forced to come to the Americas. And we're not only talking about slavery, but we're talking about different oppressive institutions right after slavery. So in the book, for example, I talk about, in the 6th chapter, I talk about how Blyden was known by so many people in the 19th century, right? In the South. Why did people in the South know Blyden? Because Blyden was associated with the American Colonization Society, where a lot of people were migrating or wanting to migrate through the American Colonization Society to Liberia and other parts of West Africa, right? And they knew Blyden because Blyden was sort of the commissioner for immigration that had been sent alongside an African-American intellectual, Alexander Crummell, who had lived in Liberia at some point and was sort of a Blyden, a friend to Blyden and was on the same side of Blyden when it came to Liberian politics, right? But Blyden is known by them because you see these letters that are coming from the South to the American Colonization Society that are desperate letters, and they want to leave the South. Why do they want to leave the South? This is the period where you have white redemption, all right after slavery, where in the aftermath of the losses of the Civil War, white people want to reestablish their superiority in the South, and unfortunately, the federal government allowed them to do that, right, by withdrawing its troops from the South and not, giving us our acres and our mules, and so forth. But what it led to was a terror in the South for Black people. All right. And so all of them wanted to leave, and they were writing to Blyden to want to leave. Maybe I should read parts of what, some of them said when they wanted to leave. These were very desperate letters that they were writing to Blyden And so I use that to talk about the fact that Blyden is a significant African or Black intellectual. Why he was the most significant? Because you had people in the South who knew him, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking intellectuals. I'm talking everyday Black people in the South who knew Blyden. So I'm going to read from, let's see, from page 160. It says here, in the aftermath of the early mid-19th century disagreements between Black and white colonization societies, Blyden, along with Henry McNeill Tanner and Alexander Crummell, were the only Blacks to have any institutional affiliation with the white-led ACS, who was also self-evidently a successful migrant, having emigrated to Liberia in 1851 and emerged as an Afro-Publican intellectual. From Liberia, Blyden championed emigration to West Africa among the Black populations of the Caribbean and in the United States. By 1891, when Blyden arrived in the United States, he and Alexander Crummell had been appointed Commissioner for Colonization by the Liberian government. The commissioners were given the mandate to travel to the United States to, quote, to present to the colored people there and elsewhere the claims and advantages of Liberia, and to invite them to come over and help build up a, quote, Negro nationality, end quote. All right. So Blyden, this is not the first time that Blyden is coming to the US. He's been coming in since the 1860s. He's coming in the 1870s, right? But I'm going to skip to 161, first paragraph. It says in 161, it was during an 1889 US visit when events began to go awry. Blyden arrived at a time when white Southerners were continuing to redeem their losses from the American Civil War. Southern redemption, which followed the collapse of Reconstruction, marks the historical period that accompanied the U.S. government's official abandonment of its post-war commitment to improving the lives of Black folk. The government had reneged on its protection of Black citizens by removing federal troops from the South. The period was also characterized by the re-emergence of white supremacy through the removal of Blacks' civil and political rights. The Black people in the South were economically dependent on whites. Promises of redistribution of land were never fulfilled. State legislatures and federal courts conspired to institutionalize racism through disenfranchisement laws, vagrancy codes, and other discriminatory measures, as lynch mobs and Ku Klux Klan violence terrorized Blacks and enforced segregation in the South. In this atmosphere, Blyden and the ACS, that is the American Colonization Society, began to receive letters from the Blacks in the rural South, inquiring about emigration to Liberia. So this was how desperate they were, right? Wanting to leave the Americas or the United States. Okay, the letters poured into the Secretary of the ACS, William Coppinger, and to Blyden from all over the United States, but especially from some parts of the Midwest as well as the South, including from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. The tone of the letters ranged from informational inquiries to pleas of desperation. A sampling of the letters should suffice. So here's where I'm going to read some of the letters, if you don't mind. Maybe in the next minute. Okay. So from Oberlin, Ohio, the ACS received a letter thanking it for quote, the annual reports and pamphlets recently given by you to the library, and quote, from Dartmouth College, Cornelius Marker wrote to Coppinger in 1891, wondering if, quote, psychology, chemistry, and physics could be taught at Liberia College as it is in the U.S. high schools and colleges, and recommended himself for the position. D.G. Hendricks, writing from Milan, Texas, mentioned that he noticed an article in the Houston Weekly concerning the deportation of the Negroes of the southern states to Liberia. Another historian, Horace George, asked to be furnished with the necessary information as to the present situation of Liberia. I should like to go there if I can. Will be of any service, as I am only a common blacksmith. From Live Oak, Florida, William Gill assured Coppinger that a great many of us colored people of this county desire to go to Liberia, therefore apply to you for more information in regards to the matter. A desperate plea came from Samantha, Alabama, where Reverend L. Davis reported Negroes of Alabama are faring bad because whites were discouraging them with, quote, pistols and whips, not allowing them to go to African lands. So there was actually an active opposition to enslaved or formerly enslaved Africans leaving the South to go to the Americas, right? They therefore wanted to leave the land of destruction and go to a land of pleasure and happiness, where they can teach their sons and daughters to be ladies and gentlemen. Other letters came from Oklahoma and Louisiana, but few sounded as desperate as those received from about 300 Arkansans between 1889 and 1893. From Pinnacle Springs, an anxious Arkansan wrote, "Why did the executive committee not answer my application? Wants to go to Liberia." John Allington, another would-be applicant, was ready to go as soon as he could sell his place. A despondent J.J. Gary asked Coppinger, "When will I go? When can I go? Would you please answer me? Please let me go in October 1891. Please, Mr. Coppinger, please let me go, this time without fail." Simply signing as Moore and wife, one correspondent wrote that times is hard here. J.W. Williams expressed his desire to remove to that country and wished to know if the ACS will assist him in getting there. So you see the desperation that people wanted to leave the South, because we're not just talking about slavery, we're talking about the aftermath of the Civil War, where you have still white oppression, and racism actually becomes institutionalized in our state legislatures, in our laws and so forth, where you could just be caught. The vagrancy laws were that you couldn't, as a black person, you couldn't move at certain times of the day, and if you were caught, you were sent back into enslavement. All right, or some type of enslavement, where you'd be working on your former master's farm for very little. And so these were the ways, and that has continued from that to active segregation and over the civil rights struggle and so forth. So when it comes to the U.S. in the specific, we're not just talking about slavery and how some we both know Akon was saying that African Americans should quickly forget about slavery, but actually, well, African Americans were not allowed to forget about slavery. Right? That's the point. They were not allowed to forget about slavery. They were forced to continue to think about slavery because the conditions that they found themselves were still equal to enslavement. Okay, they weren't allowed to enjoy of the largesse that they had helped in building in the United States.
Well, I want to highlight two things that you said, because I think it's something that oftentimes gets falls between the cracks in our history books. So the first thing that you said, you're reading the requests that Black citizens in America made to the ACS. But this is only a fraction of the Black citizens who were in the Southern America, because most people, it was illegal to read, right? So you weren't even able to read and write. You oftentimes had to work with the one person in the community who could read and write to get any kind of message out. So the actual voice of that is already marginalized. Then on top of that, the second thing that I want to emphasize is oftentimes, I'm in North Carolina, so we're very much in the South. One of the things that we hear quite often are situations where white people particularly will say, "Why don't you just leave? Why don't you just go? Why don't you just lift yourself up by your bootstraps? Why don't you forget about slavery?" Like that kind of rhetoric. And what happens is every time we do that, there are historic examples all throughout the 1800s and early 1900s of self-sustaining Black communities. I'm from Durham, North Carolina. We had a self-sustaining Black community. All these self-sustaining Black communities, what happened to them? They got run down. People got chased out. So it's like they didn't want you to leave because they knew that if you left, they would no longer have their workforce. They would no longer be able to claim supremacy over anybody else. But to me, the fact that you need somebody suggests that it's not a supremacy issue. It's that you recognize that we have more power than we recognize, right? So if we are able to put these things together and come together, despite all the barriers that they've set up for us, then I think that we can create something that's even better than what we're existing in currently. And so for me, this is kind of my push for Pan-Africanism. That's why I think we don't need to rely on the white man's anything. Like, we don't have to rely on the white man's internet, the white man's whatever. When we have the skills, tools, and abilities to come together as a diaspora and build for ourselves something that can be competitive with what we were already in reliance on. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate everything that you just put in. I'm gonna have to get that book.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm always curious. I'm always curious to find out. I mean, I know what.
Before we go,
go ahead.
Things.
I think you're breaking up.
Okay, yeah, I was breaking up. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I hear you.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so could you discuss Liberia a little bit? Because I know Blyden had an issue. He spent a lot of time in Liberia, but they were not as receptive, and because of the Liberians, he had to move to Sierra Leone. Can you touch on that?
It's an interesting situation in Liberia. Well, if you look at Blyden phenotypically, he was darker than a lot of people. But what you find out is that a lot of Americo-Liberians, people who became Americo-Liberians, that is descendants or the first migrants themselves who had migrated to Liberia, happened to be of a lighter shade of black, right? Because they had lived in the United States and so forth, and because of the nature of the interaction with Europeans and so forth. You had a lot of lighter-skinned African Americans who went to Liberia, and they became the elite of Liberia.
Charles Taylor.
Yeah. So Charles Taylor is partly Americo-Liberian. And so what you have, I quote various portions of the Liberian Reconciliation Commission, and what the Liberian Reconciliation Truth Commission, and what you have in that document is them going back to saying that what happened in the Liberian civil wars, or the various civil wars and coup d'etats, is really about what happened with the establishment of Liberia as a country, where Americo-Liberians were made to be a superior group of people over the indigenous communities of Liberia, and I discuss this within the context of what in the book I discuss as different types of Ethiopianism, and so you would see that Blyden came to Liberia with the same attitude, right? This sort of manifest destiny attitude that, well, we have experienced the West, we are used to civilization, and we are going to teach, or we're going to impose on our black brothers how to be like this, how to live like this in a better civilization. So Blyden was of that mindset, but he quickly changes his mindset. Well, not quickly, but over time, he changes his mindset to that we shouldn't be trying to lord it over these indigenous communities. He actually goes to war, because what was happening was that there were a lot of wars between the Americo-Liberians and the indigenous communities for land, for labor, and so forth. And so Blyden begins to become, because he was part of this Americo-Liberian elite club, if you like, begins to oppose the club, right? He begins to oppose this sort of notion that the Americo-Liberians were superior to the native Liberians. And that ends him some trouble with the Americo-Liberians. He's almost lynched in the streets of Liberia, and that caused him to leave Liberia permanently to go and live in Sierra Leone. So he spent the rest of his life in Sierra Leone. But the point that I think Fred is trying to elicit from me is really about the fact that the ACS, the American Colonization Society, which in the book I talk about the fact that it was a who's who of, the American, it was the Supreme Court justices, it was former American presidents who established it. And they had an ulterior motive in establishing the American colonization societies. Whereas Black colonization societies were interested in migrating to Africa for their own purposes, for freedom and so forth. Well, they were interested in getting rid of the free population of the United States and keeping the enslaved. Okay? they wanted to get rid of the free population and keeping the enslaved. And so there was opposition between the black emigration societies and the white emigration societies. And Blyden comes from the middle of that, right? When he goes to Liberia, and he's influenced by some of the ideas that some blacks also had in terms of, this Afro-Christian sense of superiority over indigenous Africans. And so that sort of leads to the establishment of Liberia, where you've had a group that had been established by the white American Colonization Society to lord it over indigenous Africans. And that created the problem from the beginning for Liberia as a country, and would end up in the various civil wars that would happen in Liberia later on.
That's right. Yeah. And and like you said, it traces back to Charles Taylor and the Civil War, and Doe. I mean, them overthrowing Doe. But if you look at Doe actually was quite successful compared to those before him. Doe was actually the first indigenous Liberian to actually get into power. His predecessors were all American Liberians. Anyway, also, can you talk a little bit about the Black Elijah and Blyden's influence on the church, and him wanting it to be more localized than Europeanized.
Europeanized, yes.
Europeanized, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, that's what I discussed, I believe, in what chapter was it? West Africa, the last chapter, West African Ethiopianism. So, I talked about, in the book, you see that I talk about different types of Ethiopianism. I talk about the Ethiopianism that emerged from the African diaspora, or the Black diaspora, which was this Afro-Christian sense of manifest destiny, that we were chosen people. We have come to experience Western ideas, Western traditions, Western technology, and we're going back home to Africa to Christianize our native brethren, and also sort of improve on their conditions and civilize them. Then you also had the intentions of the European American Ethiopianist tradition, if you like, and there are two traditions that I identify within that one that came from the United States, and one that came from Europe, specifically England, where you have the various abolition societies and so forth, and they are the ones that established Sierra Leone as a colony, right? And then you have the American Colonization Society establishing Liberia as a colony. So you can see in the aftermath of those two traditions, two colonies were established in West Africa, and Africans found themselves in those societies as well. There's a third tradition that emerges also in West Central and South Africa, and I talk about that type of Ethiopianism as sort of an apocalyptic type of Ethiopianism, where a lot of the Africans that emerged, the independent African churches that emerged, right, in the same way that you have independent African churches emerge in the United States, in Pennsylvania, you have the same thing happening all over West Africa and South Africa, right? But the ones that emerged in Southern Africa and West Central Africa had an apocalyptic turn to it, that there was going to be the coming to the end of not only the oppression, but there was something apocalyptic that was going to happen. I don't want to get too much into those details. But when we come to West Africa, you had the large influence of Edward Blyden, right? As I have explained earlier on, Blyden began to see something worthy in African ways of life when it comes to whether it was African ways of dressing, or whether it was African culture, African religions, he began to see something worthy in what Africans were doing. And so what he was asking for was not the Europeanization of Africans, but actually the Africanization of Christianity, which is the term that we use in African American and African studies to describe how Africans received Christianity. But Blyden was suggesting that rather than just copy Europeans, right? Or the type of Christianity that Europeans were giving to Africans was not the pure Christianity. It was a European form of Christianity. So Blyden was asking for a pure Christianity, someone who had studied the books, knew the origins of Christianity and so forth. He was saying that, well, we have to receive Christianity on our own terms and have to Africanize it. So he was asking for Africans to be able to wear their African clothes. He was asking for Africans to be able to sing in their own languages. He was asking for Africans to be the heads of their own churches and so forth, rather than to be imposed. So basically, they were looking for ecclesiastical independence from, let's say, the mother church in England, who would send a priest to come and oversee these Africans. When you had Africans who had themselves risen to higher ranks within the Christian church, but weren't paid the same way, weren't giving the same types of positions within the Christian church and so forth. So Blyden was sort of led this push for the Africanization of Christianity, but it was within this sort of Blyden's idea of the African personality, all right? And Blyden wanted the establishment of West African universities and so forth that would teach African languages, and so forth. So that is where Blyden's influence on the Christian church, when it comes to West Africa, that is where it comes from. He was saying that if we're going to reach and Christianize Africans, we're not going to teach them European Christianity. We're going to teach them pure Christianity. But at the same time, we're going to teach them Christianity on African terms and allow them to receive Christianity from an African perspective. And that really resonated with a lot of African intellectuals during that time. So you begin to have even dress reform societies. Now you see a lot of African preachers in African clothes and so forth. But that was, Blyden originated that type of dressing. Really, in the book, I show a picture of him now putting on, the African cap on his head, wearing the African clothes and so forth. So that's the type of influence that Blyden had on the church in terms of Africanizing the church. Yeah. And influencing a lot of preachers to begin to speak in their own languages, to begin to sing in their own languages, to allow African instruments to be used in church, right? Because African instruments were seen as devilish, they were seen as heathen, and they were not to be used in worship and so forth. So Blyden was one of the people that began to influence a lot of African preachers to take up some of these things within the church.
Wow.
Can you imagine how boring church was without African contribution?
I know, right?
Yeah, a lot of hymns were sung, and so you had a lot of people who began to write African hymns, and so forth, and began to use African instruments in church and so forth. But Blyden, what Fred is talking about is actually someone who was influenced by Blyden, and who, if I can actually, I'm going to see if I can share my screen.
Yeah, you can.
I'm going to an image of.
Okay.
That was my fault. There we go. Wow.
So you see different African preachers. So this guy, Prophet William Wade Harris, was a Liberian that takes up this sort of Blyden's idea of Africanizing Christianity, and he walks from Liberia to the western part of Ghana, preaching and converting people to Christianity. And you would see in the way that he dressed, in the things that he used, you see him with a gourd, with a cross and so forth. There's a very popular Ghanaian who also used the same method by the name of Samson Opong. You see here. All right. Yeah. So this became a tradition. It's kind of a veer of Blyden. I'm not sure that Blyden was a little bit of a conservative. I'm not sure that he would have gone as extreme as these people went. But he was very much influential in how do I stop? Okay, stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. So Blyden became very, influential. So that's what I talk about in the book. I think Fred took some time to read that portion of the book, so that's why he's asking the question, right?
Yeah, of course. That's how it touched me. The revolutionary way of preaching and sharing the gospel. Since I'm a preacher, so that really excited me.
I thought as much, and what we do actually also influenced the way that I wrote that particular chapter. If I would take some time to read chapter 6. So on chapter 6 in 165, it says, a year following the demise of Edward Wilmot Blyden in Sierra Leone, the prophetic mission of William Wade Harris began in Liberia. In 1913, claiming instructions from the angel Gabriel and a prophetic anointing and the mantle of the prophets Elijah and John the Baptist, Harris started to walk from eastern Liberia towards the Ivory Coast. He was clad in white robes and a turban with a bamboo cross in his right hand as his staff. He also carried a Bible and a gourd bowl for baptismal water, as well as a gourd rattle for music in his left hand. Harris trudged along and preached the Christian gospel in villages, towns, and cities from Liberia to the western part of the Gold Coast, all the while baptizing and healing thousands of converts. This feat earned him sobriquets like Premier African Evangelist, the most extraordinary one-man evangelical crusade that Africa has ever known, and the Black Elijah of West Africa. Because of his activities, attributes, and accomplishments, Harris is cited in missiology as a pioneer in West African Ethiopianism and the growth of independent African churches. The connection between Harris's activities and Edward Blyden, the true founder of West African Ethiopianism and an advocate of the West African Church, are little known. So what I basically do is use William Wade Harris as a way to open up the discussion about the importance of Blyden as the pioneer of this sort of Africanization of the West African Church, and how he influenced many African churches in not only in Liberia, but in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, to establish independent West African churches, in Ghana as well. Casely Hayford, a lot of people know Casely Hayford. His brother, Mark Hayford, started an independent African church. What was the AME? The African Methodist Episcopal in the U.S. tradition. He started that a branch of that church in West Africa, alongside somebody who was known as Ato Ahuma, right? And in terms of Ato Ahuma, he had actually changed his name from Solomon, right? So part of what Blyden was doing was that people were no longer using their European giving names. They began using their African names. They were comfortable with being called the African. So Atohuma, changes his name from the English names that he was because his last name was basically English, Solomon, right? And he changes that. So that was all part of the Blyden influence. So Blyden had these intellectuals and preachers that he influenced in the 19th century who would lead the revolution towards the Africanization of the church and allowing Africans to be a part of that space in terms of the top hierarchy of the various African churches.
Wow. Jesse.
Well, I mean, first off, I just want to thank you for your time and the information and everything. I'm learning afresh today. I think that I love conversations like this because it combines some of the things that we know about ourselves, but also the history that oftentimes is not taught in our curriculum. And I appreciate the fact that you're able to expose something that I hope everybody who's listening will go and pick up and read. I was just happy when you were talking about the conventions in the 1900s and the 1940s. Even that was astonishing to me when I initially found out about it right before we launched the show. So like just the concept that Black people on a global scale have been trying to come together since like the 1800s is mind blowing, because of course nobody in my school system is going to teach me that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to share the link to the book and show you a copy of the book. This is a very important book. Oops. Okay, there's a wrong link. Let me copy it again. what the book looks like. Go in and do you see my screen?
I see it.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a copy of the book and the Blyden's intellectual transformations in Pan-Africanism, Islam, and indigenous West African church. We didn't even scratch the surface. We just it was just like a little overview. But if you want more, go and purchase it, and you'll be supporting one of our own.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Prof. And today we just have one question because we went over time, rightfully so. So Prof touched on it, and I'm going to ask the question: who was George Pardmore? Who was George Pardmore? We do a trivia at the end of our shows.
Okay.
So we're going to give 10 seconds to our audience, whoever gets it. This is an easy one, so I'm going to move quickly. Who was George Pardmore?
All right.
Where's Michael? I haven't heard from Michael today.
Yeah, I don't know if Michael's on today.
Michael won a gift card last week. A reigning champion. So 10, 9, 8, 7. Any Ghanaian brothers? One of the library in Ghana is named after him.
Spent a lot of time there, the George Pardmore Library.
Yeah, wow. 6. Okay. Prof, will you tell us about George Pardmore?
Well, George Pardmore was a Trinidadian scholar who how do I say? Well, he's very much of the Pan-African story. He was part of the co-conveners for the 1945 Pan-African Congress alongside Kwame Nkrumah. The boys were sort of the face of the movement, but they were really the ones that did a lot of the work in 1945.
Yeah.
And he like a lot of Pan-Africanists spent a lot of time in different places. He spent a lot of time in the United States, went to Howard at some point, spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, if I recall, and then he travels to Germany and then ends up in England, all right, and began to lead sort of the movement in England alongside other African intellectuals, CLR James. You know, they were part of the sort of the movement against Italy trying to invade Ethiopia, and they formed the International Friends of Abyssinia, which was another group that was formed. So he was very much at the forefront of the Pan-African movement, and that's it was in London that he connected with Nkrumah at the recommendation of CLR James when Nkrumah was on his way from the United States to England. And then he becomes a part of the independence movement, because what happens is that Nkrumah makes him a part of his trusted advisees in Ghana, and he was sort of the intellectual, or the brain behind Nkrumah's sort of the All African People's Congress in Ghana, and Nkrumah's push for the African the African Union, what is now the African Union, or the Organization of African Unity. Yeah, so he was sort of the intellectual or the brain. Yeah, that influenced Nkrumah's ideology, Nkrumah's theoretical understanding of organizing and getting a Pan-African movement together. Yeah, but he was of Trinidadian descent. Yeah,
of Trinidadian descent.
Henry,
one of our brothers from the diaspora.
Yeah.
So I shared Dr. Harry's Facebook information. You can contact him. Very knowledgeable about the diaspora, as you can see. We could go on for a long time. I know Jesse was enjoying this just as I was. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so if you haven't done so already, like our Facebook page, and this video will be up on our YouTube page. So go and subscribe, like, share this information. This is very good information and knowledge that we need. As you can see, Blyden influence from W.E.B. Du Bois to Kwame Nkrumah, George Pardman, and all the Pan-Africanists from years back. All right. Any final thoughts, Jesse?
Yes, we need to continue what the good professors already started in emphasizing African intellectualism. I think it gets overlooked far too often, and it seems sometimes as if this is the Western way of downplaying Black contribution altogether. But we as a people are the ones who have to promote it. So get the book, support the good professor here in trying to get the word out about Edward Blyden, and in doing so, support posthumously Edward Blyden, and we can get together, build these networks, and do everything that in his mindset he is set out to do.
Good, good. There we go. There we have it. So thank you, Dr. Harry, once again.
All right. Thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity to be here and to share my work.
All right. Okay, bye.